That hideous machine is a blight on this community, and I will have it removed and your property seized if necessary, Mr. Turner. You are in violation of covenants you clearly can't comprehend." The words, laced with a venomous sort of glee, hung in the crisp autumn air between us, colder than the morning frost clinging to the grass. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, stood on her side of the freshly surveyed property line, her considerable frame clad in a powder blue tracksuit that seemed to be losing a valiant struggle against her bulk. Her face was a mask of indignant fury, her eyes narrowed to slits as she gestured a dismissive, diamond-ringed hand toward my Wood Miser portable sawmill. The machine sat silent for the moment, a beast of orange-painted steel and hydraulic lines resting beside a neat stack of felled pine logs, the air still sweet with the scent of fresh sawdust. For a split second, the sheer audacity of her threat to seize my land I had bought and paid for, land that was explicitly, legally, and geographically not part of her precious HOA, left me speechless. This was my 10 acres, my sanctuary after 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, my future. And this woman, this stranger, was threatening to take it all away because she didn't like the look of my equipment. The absurdity was so profound it was almost funny, but the dead serious look of power-crazed conviction on her face strangled any humor before it could form. This wasn't a joke. It was a declaration of war. If you've ever had a run-in with a nightmare HOA or a neighbor who thinks they own the very air you breathe, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, drop a comment down below and tell me where you're watching from or share your own story. We're a community here, and believe me, you're going to want to see how this one ends. Now back to the battlefield. I had bought this property 6 months prior, a beautiful rolling tract of land thick with mature loblolly pines and a few stubborn old-growth oaks, bordering the back edge of the new, meticulously planned Whispering Pines development. My wife Sarah and I had fallen in love with it instantly. It was our dream, a place to build a small, self-sufficient life after 2 decades of moving wherever the military sent me. The property was zoned agricultural residential, a key detail I had triple-checked before signing the papers. It was perfect. The crowning jewel of the deal, however, wasn't just the land itself, but the opportunity it represented. The county had just approved the construction of a new elementary school, a project the residents of Whispering Pines had overwhelmingly championed in public forums and voted for in the last local election. They were desperate for it. The existing schools were overcrowded, and the new development was full of young families. Through a contact from my Army days who was now in county procurement, I learned they wanted to build the school with as many local materials as possible, a green initiative that was popular with the community. I owned 10 acres of prime timber, literally next door. I submitted a bid, heavily undercutting the big logging companies, to fell, mill, and deliver the structural beams and siding for the new school right from my own land. It was a win-win-win. The county saved a fortune on materials and transport. They got their locally sourced PR moment, and I got a contract that would pay off a huge chunk of our land and set us up for the future. The portable sawmill was the linchpin of the whole operation. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, efficient and surprisingly quiet for what it did. I had all my permits in order: commercial timber harvesting permit from the state, a land disturbance permit from the county, and a notarized copy of my contract with the school district. I was, in every legal and moral sense, completely in the right. But Karen didn't care about permits or contracts. She cared about aesthetics, her aesthetic. And my sawmill, a symbol of honest work and community contribution, was, in her eyes, nothing more than a scrapyard eyesore. The first volley had been a polite-looking letter slipped into a crisp HOA-branded envelope and left in my mailbox, despite my property not having an HOA-affiliated address. It was a friendly reminder about community standards, citing rules about commercial vehicle storage and industrial operations. I'd initially dismissed it as an automated mistake. The second letter, arriving a week later, was less friendly. It was a formal notice of violation, listing a fine of $100 per day, retroactive to the day the sawmill was delivered. The total was already at $700. It was absurd, like getting a speeding ticket from the government of France while driving in Ohio. But her standing there, threatening to seize my property, a place she had no legal authority over, elevated it from absurd to alarming. She was either dangerously ignorant of the law or, more likely, she believed she was the law. My calm, disciplined army training kicked in. You don't engage a sniper by running out into the open. You assess, you gather intel, you choose your ground. I took a slow breath, my eyes locking with hers. "Ma'am," I said, my voice level and calm, a stark contrast to her shrill tirade. "You are trespassing, and you are making threats you can't possibly back up. I suggest you return to your property before this conversation has to be continued with the sheriff's department." Her face flushed a deep mottled purple. The idea that I would dare to challenge her authority was clearly a foreign concept. She puffed out her chest. "I am the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I am this community's authority. You will learn your place, Mr. Turner. You and your rusty junk pile. The fines are accumulating. The next letter you receive will be from our attorney." With that, she spun around with a surprising amount of agility and marched back across the invisible line, leaving me standing in the sudden silence. The sweet smell of pine now tinged with the acrid scent of a brewing war. I knew then that reason wouldn't work. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up. This was a battle for my home, my livelihood, and my peace, and I had a feeling it was going to get a lot uglier before it got better. I watched Karen retreat, her indignant waddle a perfect physical manifestation of her personality, until she disappeared behind a manicured row of Leyland cypress that marked the beginning of her domain. The silence she left behind was heavy. My heart was pounding, a hard, rhythmic drum against my ribs, not from fear, but from a cold, familiar anger. It was the same feeling I'd get in Afghanistan when dealing with some local warlord who thought his handful of armed thugs made him a king. The tactics were different: HOA bylaws instead of RPGs, lawyers instead of enforcers. But the mindset was identical. Raw, unearned entitlement backed by the threat of force. I walked back to the sawmill and ran a hand over its cool steel frame. It wasn't a rusty junk pile. It was a state-of-the-art LT-40 hydraulic, a machine I had saved for years to buy, a tool that was supposed to help me build a new life, not start a war. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the property line, capturing the spot where she had stood, then panned over to my neatly stacked logs in the mill. Documentation. Rule number 1. Assume every engagement will be scrutinized later. My wife, Sarah, came out of the small cabin we were living in while planning the main house. She had a mug of coffee in each hand. Her face was tight with worry. "I heard shouting," she said, handing me a mug. The warmth seeped into my cold hands. "You heard Karen," I corrected, taking a long sip. "She's threatening to have the sawmill removed and seize the property." Sarah's eyes went wide. "Seize the property? Can she do that? We're not in the HOA." "No, she can't," I reassured her, though the conviction in Karen's voice had planted a tiny seed of doubt. "She's blowing smoke, but she's the kind of person who can make that smoke so thick it chokes you." We stood there for a moment, the dream of our quiet, peaceful life seeming to shimmer and fade like a heat haze. We had poured everything into this: our savings, my retirement, years of planning. The idea that it could all be jeopardized by one power-hungry neighbor was infuriating. Later that day, I decided on a course of proactive de-escalation. Maybe, just maybe, if she understood the context, she would back down. It was a long shot, but I had to try the reasonable approach first. I printed a copy of my contract with the school district, highlighting the parts about the project being for the new Whispering Pines Elementary. I also printed a satellite map showing my property lines and the school's future location, drawing a simple arrow to show the timber's ridiculously short journey. I walked over to the edge of my property, stopping well short of the HOA's border, and waited. It didn't take long. A motion sensor on her prize-winning rose bushes probably alerted her. She emerged from her house, this time in a flowing caftan that made her look like a malevolent cruise ship. "What do you want now?" she barked from her porch. "I wanted to give you this," I said, holding up the papers. "I thought there might be a misunderstanding. The timber I'm milling? It's for the new elementary school, the one your community voted for. This contract is with the county school board. I explained how it was saving taxpayer money, how it was a local project. I laid it all out, clear and simple. She walked slowly to the edge of her lawn, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She didn't take the papers. She didn't even look at them. I don't care if you're building a golden chariot for the mayor, she sneered. This is a luxury residential community. We have standards. That thing, she pointed again at the sawmill, is an industrial operation. It's noisy, it's ugly, and it's driving down our property values. The rules are the rules. But they're not my rules, I said, my patience wearing thin. My property is not part of your association. Proximity implies responsibility, she shot back, a phrase so meaningless and yet so self-assured that it stunned me. The noise you make, the sight of your mess, it all bleeds over into our lives. It's a nuisance. And the county has nuisance ordinances. I've already spoken to them. The threat was clear. She was going to bypass the HOA's lack of jurisdiction and try to use the county government as her weapon. The conversation was over. I had offered an olive branch and she had tried to set it on fire. I walked back to my cabin, the papers still in my hand. Sarah looked at me, her expression questioning. She doesn't care, I said, dropping the papers on the table. She said it's a nuisance and she's reported it to the county. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in bureaucratic harassment. The fines from the HOA kept coming, the total now climbing into the thousands. A ridiculous, unenforceable number that was nonetheless designed to intimidate. Then came the official visit. A county code enforcement officer, a tired-looking man named Dave, showed up in his little white truck. He was polite, almost apologetic. Got a complaint about an unpermitted commercial operation and noise, he said, avoiding my eyes as he looked at the sawmill. I invited him in, offered him a coffee, and laid out my entire file on the kitchen table. The state forestry permits, the county land disturbance permit, the fully executed school contract, the zoning certificate for my property. I had every T crossed and every I dotted. Dave spent 20 minutes looking through it all, his expression slowly changing from weary duty to something like impressed relief. Well, Mr. Turner, he said, closing the folder, you're more buttoned up than any commercial contractor I've dealt with this year. Everything is perfectly in order. As for the noise, the ordinance is for sustained noise after 10 p.m. You're running a diesel engine during daylight hours on AR-zoned land. You're not in violation. He handed me his card. I'll file my report, and that should be the end of it from my end. But, he added, lowering his voice, the complainant, a Mrs. Karen Miller, was insistent. She calls my office 3 times a day. You might want to watch your back. People like that don't give up easy. His warning proved prophetic. My victory was short-lived. Karen, thwarted by the letter of the law, switched to a campaign of misinformation. On the Whispering Pines community Facebook group, she began posting vague but pointed warnings about industrial encroachment on the neighborhood's borders. She wrote about the constant grating noise and the unsightly destruction of beautiful forest land, conveniently omitting that the forest land was my private property and the destruction was a sustainable harvest for the local school. She implied property values were about to plummet. Soon the climate shifted. The friendly waves I used to get from residents walking their dogs along the road bordering my land stopped. They were replaced with glares, people pulling their children a little closer as they passed. Someone threw a bag of trash over my fence. A high school kid in a jacked-up truck, probably the son of one of Karen's cronies, laid rubber on the pavement in front of my gate, yelling something I couldn't make out. It was a siege, a slow-drip poison of social pressure and petty vandalism. Karen was turning the very community I was trying to serve against me. One evening, Sarah found a post on the Facebook page that went too far. It was a photo of me, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, standing by the sawmill. Karen had written above it, "This is the man responsible for the industrial noise plaguing our peaceful community. He refuses to listen to reason. Let's all encourage him to respect our neighborhood." The comments below were a cesspool of fear and anger, people calling me greedy, a destroyer, a menace. Seeing my image used like that, a target painted on my back, was the final straw. The time for being reasonable was over. Karen had escalated this from a dispute to a campaign of harassment. And if there's one thing 20 years in the military teaches you, It's how to handle a determined enemy. You stop reacting. You start planning. You gather intelligence, you build your case, and you choose the moment to strike back. Not with anger, but with overwhelming, undeniable force. That night, I installed 4 high-definition, night vision security cameras covering every angle of my property line and gate. I bought a digital voice recorder. From now on, every interaction, every piece of trash, every threatening glare would be documented. Karen wanted a war of attrition. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The installation of the cameras was a turning point for me mentally. It was a physical act that shifted my posture from defense to offense. I wasn't just weathering the storm anymore. I was building a fortress and gathering ammunition. The little red light on each camera was a silent promise that the truth would be recorded, even if Karen's narrative was louder for the moment. The very next morning, as if on cue, I caught the first piece of evidence. A pristine white Lexus SUV, one I recognized as belonging to Karen's closest friend on the HOA board, slowed to a crawl at my gate. The passenger window rolled down, and a perfectly manicured hand tossed a half-eaten bagel onto my driveway. It was petty, childish, but the camera caught it all in crystal-clear 4K. The license plate, the driver's face, the bagel's pathetic arc through the air. I saved the video file, labeling it Exhibit A. It felt good. My new routine became a ritual of discipline. Before firing up the Sawmill at 8 a.m. sharp, I'd walk the property line, my phone camera ready. I photographed the new no trespassing signs I had posted. I documented the tire tracks from where the teenager had spun out. After shutting down at 5 p.m., I'd review the day's security footage, archiving any incidents. The digital voice recorder became a permanent fixture in my shirt pocket. Every time I went to the end of my driveway to get the mail, it was on and recording. I felt like I was back in a TOC, a tactical operations center, managing a flow of intelligence, building a pattern of life on my adversary. Karen, meanwhile, was not idle. Having failed with code enforcement, she had clearly been poring over HOA documents and county records, searching for any loophole, any forgotten clause she could twist to her advantage. Her next move was both more audacious and more legally complex. A new letter arrived, this one not from the HOA, but from a law firm. Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. A name so cliché it had to be real. It was a formal cease and desist, citing not the HOA covenants, but a broad county ordinance about public nuisances, and more alarmingly, claiming I was in violation of a scenic easement that was allegedly attached to my property deed. The letter demanded the immediate cessation of all milling operations and removal of the sawmill, pending a full legal review. The phrase scenic easement sent a jolt of ice through my veins. That was a new one. I had read my deed and the title report cover to cover, but it was dense legalese. Was it possible I had missed something? Something that gave the neighboring development some measure of control over what my land looked like? The doubts she had planted on day one began to sprout. This was beyond my expertise. It was time to call in my own heavy artillery. I didn't want just any lawyer. I wanted someone who understood the mentality, who wouldn't just play legal patty cake, but would fight. I made a call to the local VFW post and asked for recommendations. The post commander, a gruff old Marine named Gunny, gave me a name without hesitation. "You want Ben Carter," he said. "Former JAG officer, Army. Smart as a whip and hates bullies more than he hates MREs. He specializes in property law and kicking self-important asses. Tell him Gunny sent you." The next day, I was sitting in Ben Carter's office. It was Spartan, decorated with a framed paratrooper flag and a photo of a younger Ben in uniform, smiling somewhere in a dusty, sun-bleached country. He was in his late 40s, lean, with a sharp, intelligent gaze that missed nothing. I laid out the whole story, starting with Karen's first threat and ending with the lawyer's letter. I handed him my entire file, the permits, the contract, photos of the harassment, and a USB drive with the security footage. Ben listened intently, his fingers steepled, not interrupting once. When I finished, he picked up the cease and desist letter and read it, a faint, cynical smile playing on his lips. "Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe," he mused. "Of course, They're the go-to firm for petty tyrants with deep pockets. They specialize in slap suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation. Basically, they bully you with legal fees until you give up. He looked at me. She can't win on the merits of this, Mark. The nuisance ordinance is too vague for what you're doing, and your permits gut that argument anyway. This scenic easement is her Hail Mary. Let me see your title report. I handed it over. Ben's eyes scanned the document, his brow furrowed in concentration. He spent a solid 10 minutes reading, occasionally humming to himself. Finally, he looked up, and the cynical smile was back, wider this time. "Oh, this is beautiful," he said, tapping a paragraph on page 7. "This is amateur hour. Yes, there's an easement. It's a 5-foot-wide utility easement that runs along the road. It was granted to the county 30 years ago for future power or water lines. It has absolutely nothing to do with scenery. The HOA has no standing to enforce it, and even if they did, it only gives the county the right to dig a trench, not to tell you what you can do on the other 9.9 acres of your land." The relief that washed over me was immense. So this letter is just a bluff? It's a high-priced, professionally written bluff. But yes, it's a bluff, Ben confirmed. They're hoping the scary letterhead and legal jargon will make you fold. He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "But we're not going to just call their bluff. We're going to raise the stakes. They've opened the door, and we're going to walk right through it. She's harassing you. She's libeling you online. Most importantly, she is actively trying to interfere with a lucrative government contract. That's called tortious interference, and the damages can be substantial. We're not just going to defend, we're going to counter-sue." The ferocity in his voice was exactly what I needed to hear. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a fellow soldier, and he saw this for what it was, a fight. "So what's the plan?" I asked. "First," Ben said, "we draft a response letter from me to Dewey, Cheatham and Howe, that not only tells them, in polite legal terms, to go pound sand, but also puts them on notice that a counterclaim for harassment and tortious interference is imminent. We'll attach copies of all your permits and a little note about the actual nature of the utility easement they seem to have misinterpreted. That will get their attention." He grinned. "Second, you keep doing exactly what you're doing. Run that sawmill every day from 8 to 5. Fulfill your contract. And keep those cameras rolling. Let her make the next move. I have a feeling it's going to be a stupid one." I left Ben's office feeling 10 feet tall. The fog of uncertainty had lifted, replaced by a clear sense of purpose. The plan was in motion. I had a powerful ally, and the law, the actual law, was on my side. Karen had tried to weaponize paperwork, but she had no idea that I had just recruited a master of the craft. The game had changed. I was no longer just the target. I was the hunter, setting a trap. Ben's letter, a masterwork of polite, professional venom, went out the next day. He CC'd the county attorney's office and the school district's legal department, a subtle power move to show Karen's lawyers that we had bigger players aware of the situation. The letter methodically dismantled their claims, cited the specific statutes that protected my operation, and concluded by formally notifying them of our intent to seek damages for tortious interference with my contract, attaching an estimated loss calculation for every day the project was potentially delayed. It was the legal equivalent of a perfectly aimed sniper shot right at their bottom line. The effect was immediate. For a full week, there was silence. No new fines in the mail, no snide posts on the community Facebook page, no bagel-tossing cronies. It was an eerie quiet, the kind of calm that comes before a storm breaks. I used the time to work, pushing the sawmill hard, turning massive pine logs into stacks of sweet-smelling lumber. The pile of beams and boards for the school grew steadily, a tangible monument to my defiance. Every cut of the blade felt like a small victory. But I knew Karen wasn't the type to retreat. She was regrouping, her fury no doubt stoked by the legal slapdown from Ben. Her next move, when it came, was a physical escalation, more brazen than anything before. One morning I arrived at my gate to find 2 men from a local surveying company pounding wooden stakes into the ground. They were bright orange, impossible to miss, and they formed a line directly across my gravel driveway, about 10 feet in from the main road. The line perfectly corresponded with the 5-foot utility easement Ben had told me about. Standing on her side of the property line, arms crossed, was Karen. A smug, triumphant smirk was plastered across her face. "Good morning, Mr. Turner," she called out, her voice dripping with condescension. "As you can see, we've had the easement officially marked. As per the legal rights granted by this easement, which our lawyers have affirmed, this land is under the purview of the community for access and maintenance. Therefore, you are no longer permitted to move your heavy industrial equipment across it. Your access is blocked." My blood ran cold. This was a direct physical blockade. She was using a complete misinterpretation of a utility easement to try and trap my sawmill on the property and prevent me from hauling the finished lumber out. My truck, my trailer, the logs I still needed to bring in from the back of the property, everything was cut off. The two surveyors, a couple of young guys who looked deeply uncomfortable, refused to make eye contact. "Ma'am, you can't be serious," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage boiling in my gut. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, where the digital recorder was already running. "This is a utility easement. It's for running pipes or cables, not for you to block my legal access to my own property." "My lawyers disagree," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "This is now a protected zone. One more tire track across this line, and I'll have your vehicles towed and you charged with trespassing on community-managed land. Have a nice day." She turned and walked away, leaving me staring at a line of orange-tipped sticks that represented a complete shutdown of my entire operation. I could see her vision, my project strangled, my contract defaulted, my sawmill rusting behind a barricade of her own making, all while she watched from her window with grim satisfaction. I called Ben immediately. "She's blockaded my driveway, Ben. She hired surveyors and put stakes across the access road, claiming the easement gives her control." I could almost hear Ben's mind working on the other end of the line. There was a pause, and then he chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "Oh, she is a gift that keeps on giving," he said. "This is so much better than I hoped. Mark, do not, under any circumstances, remove those stakes or cross that line. Do not engage with her. Just take detailed photos and videos of the stakes, her presence there, everything. Document the fact that your access is completely obstructed." "But Ben, I'm dead in the water," I protested. "I can't move logs. I can't haul out the finished lumber. The school district is expecting the first delivery next week. If I miss that, I'm in breach of contract." "You won't be," Ben said, his voice firm and confident, "because she is the one causing the breach. Mark, this is the legal leverage we've been waiting for. She has just handed us a perfect textbook case for an emergency injunction and a massive claim for damages. She's moved from harassment to actively and physically obstructing your business. A judge will take that very, very seriously." His plan was already forming. "Here's what we do. First, you're going to call the school superintendent, Mr. Evans. You're going to calmly explain, as a courtesy, that your first delivery will be delayed. You will explain that it's not your fault, but that the president of the Whispering Pines HOA has illegally blockaded your state-permitted and county-approved worksite. Don't be emotional, just state the facts. Let him be the one to get angry." "Okay, I can do that," I said. "Second," Ben continued, "I am going to draft an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order against Karen Miller and the Whispering Pines HOA. We will file it first thing tomorrow morning. We'll ask the judge to order them to remove the obstruction immediately and to cease all contact and harassment. And attached to that motion will be our counterclaim for tortious interference, updated with new damages for every day this blockade remains in place. She just turned our negotiating position into a nuke." The final piece of his plan was the most satisfying. "And third, you are going to reach out to that code enforcement officer, Dave, the one who said she was insistent. Tell him what she's done. County officials don't like it when private citizens try to misappropriate public easements for their own petty wars. He might not be able to do anything officially, but he's a witness, and he talks to people." I hung up the phone, my anger replaced with a cold, clear focus. This was the moment, the decisive point in the engagement where the enemy overextends and exposes their flank. Karen, in her arrogant overreach, had built her own trap. She thought those orange stakes were a wall. She didn't realize they were the bars of her own cage. I spent the rest of the afternoon documenting. I took hundreds of photos from every angle. I shot video, narrating the situation in a calm, factual tone. Then I made the call to Mr. Evans, the school superintendent. Just as Ben predicted, his reaction was one of stunned disbelief, which quickly morphed into cold fury. "She's doing what?" he exclaimed. "The head of the HOA that begged us for this school is now blocking the materials for it? Unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. Put this in an email to me right now, Mr. Turner. I need a paper trail. Don't you worry about the contract deadline. We'll handle that." I think it's time I had a little chat with Mrs. Miller's lawyer and perhaps a few members of her board. The alliance was growing. Karen thought she was isolating me, but she was actually isolating herself, building a wall between her and the very community she claimed to represent. The battle lines were no longer just on my property. They were about to be drawn all over Whispering Pines. The morning after the blockade, the air was thick with a tense, expectant silence. I followed Ben's instructions to the letter, treating my property like a crime scene. I didn't touch the stakes. I didn't even start the sawmill, wanting to document a full day of forced inactivity. The silence from my usually humming machine was more powerful than any noise it could make. Meanwhile, Ben was launching his legal blitzkrieg. By 9:05 a.m., he had filed the emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, TRO, with the county court. The filing was a work of art, a 20-page document detailing Karen's escalating campaign of harassment, complete with photographic exhibits of the trash, the online posts, and the grand finale, the illegal blockade. It named Karen Miller personally, as well as the Whispering Pines HOA, making them both liable. Crucially, it included a sworn affidavit from me detailing the contractual obligations to the school and the financial damages I was incurring daily. By 10:30 a.m., a process server was walking up Karen's perfectly manicured flagstone path to hand-deliver the legal papers. I watched through binoculars from my cabin window. Her reaction was cinematic. She took the thick envelope, ripped it open, and as she read, her face went through a rapid series of transformations. From smug curiosity to confusion, then to pale shock, and finally to a deep apoplectic red. She screamed something at the retreating process server, slammed her door so hard I thought the glass would break, and then a few minutes later, roared out of her driveway in her Lexus, tires squealing. She was headed, no doubt, to the offices of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. The second part of the plan was also in motion. My email to Mr. Evans, the school superintendent, had lit a fire under the school district. He was a man who did not suffer fools, especially when they threatened his budget and timeline. He immediately called an emergency meeting with the district's lawyers, and then, as he had promised, began making calls. The first was to the HOA's law firm, where he informed them in no uncertain terms that their client was now interfering with a public works project and that the school district was reserving its right to join my lawsuit to recoup its own delay-related costs. The second call he made was to a member of the HOA board, a man named Tom Albright, whose kids were slated to attend the new school. Tom, as it turned out, was a reasonable guy who had been growing tired of Karen's dictatorial style. He had no idea she had escalated things to the point of a physical blockade. According to the story he later told me, he was horrified. He and a few other board members who were also parents had been under the impression that Karen was simply handling a minor zoning dispute. The news that she had acted unilaterally to block the project they all desperately wanted sent shockwaves through the HOA's leadership. The community alliance Ben had predicted began to coalesce. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Is this Mr. Turner?" a hesitant voice asked. "My name is Susan. I live on Whispering Pine Circle. I just want to say I'm so sorry for what's happening. A few of us are just finding out what Karen has really been up to, and we're furious. She doesn't speak for all of us." It was the first crack in the wall of hostility. Susan explained that Tom Albright had called a few of the more level-headed residents and explained the situation. They were appalled that the new school was being jeopardized. The narrative Karen had so carefully crafted of a noble president protecting the community from an industrial blight was crumbling, being replaced by the truth. A petty tyrant on a power trip was holding their children's education hostage. "We have a community meeting scheduled for next week," Susan said. "It's going to be a bloodbath. Can you be there? People need to hear your side of the story directly." "I'll be there," I promised. The tide was turning. Karen had united the community, just not in the way she intended. The next day, we had our hearing for the TRO in front of Judge Morrison, a no-nonsense older woman with a reputation for efficiency. Karen was there with her lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named Mr. Cheatham. Karen looked smug, as if this was just another formality on her path to victory. Ben was calm, organized, and prepared. He presented our case, not with high-flown rhetoric, but with a simple, crushing mountain of facts. He showed the judge the photos of the blockade. He presented my permits. He introduced my contract with the school. Mr. Cheatham, in his defense, argued that the HOA was simply acting to protect the aesthetic integrity of the community and enforcing a valid easement. Judge Morrison looked over her glasses at him. "Mr. Cheatham, is it your contention that a utility easement, granted to the county for the potential future installation of water lines, gives your client the right to block a private citizen's access to his own property?" "We believe our interpretation of the easement's language is defensible, Your Honor," Cheatham said, his confidence wavering slightly. "It's not," the judge said flatly. "It's absurd. This is a public utility easement, not a private kingdom's gate. You can't block his driveway." She then turned her steely gaze on Karen. "Ma'am, did you order those stakes placed there?" "I acted on the advice of counsel to protect our community," Karen said, puffing herself up. The judge was not impressed. "You acted to harass this man and interfere with his business. The court grants the temporary restraining order. You and the Whispering Pines HOA are hereby ordered to remove the obstruction within the next 2 hours. You are ordered to have no contact with Mr. Turner. You will not set foot on his property. You will not post about him online. You will not encourage others to harass him. Is that clear?" Karen's face was ashen. "Furthermore," the judge continued, looking at Ben, "your counterclaim for damages will proceed. I suggest you all think very carefully about your next steps." We walked out of the courtroom into the bright sunshine. I felt a profound sense of relief, but Ben was all business. "This isn't over," he said. "This was just round one. She's been given a direct order by a judge. Let's see how she handles it. Bullies hate being told what to do." As if to prove his point, when I got back to my property, the stakes were still there. 2 hours passed. 3, 4. Karen was defying a direct court order. I called Ben. "The stakes are still there." Ben's voice was grimly satisfied. "Perfect. She's decided to martyr herself. I'm filing a motion for contempt of court." This is how they destroy themselves, Mark. They can't accept that they've lost. Karen's arrogance was now not just her own undoing. It was a gift to our case, gift wrapped and delivered with a bow. She was no longer just fighting me. She was fighting the entire judicial system. The contempt of court motion was filed the very next morning. The wheels of justice, which had seemed so slow and distant, were now grinding with terrifying speed and precision, aimed directly at Karen. A hearing was set for the following week. In the meantime, Judge Morrison, incensed by the blatant defiance of her order, dispatched the sheriff's department. 2 deputies arrived at my property line, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and grim duty. They had a copy of the judge's order. They walked over to Karen's house and knocked on the door. I watched the entire exchange from my porch. Karen came out, indignant, and began to lecture the deputies about her rights and the community's standards. One of the deputies, a tall, weathered man with zero patience written on his face, simply held up the court order and said, "Ma'am, you can explain it to the judge at your contempt hearing. Right now, these stakes are coming out. Either you remove them or we will, and we'll add the cost of our time to the bill you're already racking up with the court." Faced with the unblinking authority of law enforcement, Karen finally, grudgingly complied. She stomped over to the driveway and, with furious, violent yanks, pulled each orange-tipped stake from the ground, tossing them into a pile like kindling. The blockade was over. The physical symbol of her power lay in a pathetic heap on the side of the road. I savored the moment for a few minutes. Then I walked to the sawmill and fired it up. The roar of the diesel engine was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of freedom, of work, of victory. Word of the deputy's visit and Karen's forced removal of the stakes spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire. The story was told and retold on neighborhood text chains and hushed phone calls, embellished with each telling. Karen's carefully constructed image as a powerful protector was shattered, replaced by the reality, a belligerent woman who had to be forced by the police to obey the law. Her power was an illusion, and the whole community had just seen behind the curtain. The day of the HOA community meeting arrived. The atmosphere in the rented clubhouse room was electric. It was standing room only, packed with anxious, angry residents. I saw Tom Albright and Susan, who both gave me a subtle, encouraging nod. I saw the parents of future elementary school students, their faces grim, and in the front, at a long table, sat the HOA board. Karen was in the center, looking pale and strained, but still attempting to project an aura of control. Sarah was beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. Ben was there too, sitting in the front row, a silent, imposing presence with a thick briefcase at his feet. Karen began the meeting by trying to control the narrative, launching into a prepared speech about unprecedented challenges and the need to protect our community's integrity and property values from outside industrial forces. She spoke of my sawmill as if it were a toxic waste dump, a direct threat to their way of life. The speech might have worked a month ago. Now the room listened with a stony, skeptical silence. When she finished, Tom Albright, the board member, stood up. "Karen," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "I think the community deserves to know the full story. Is it true that you acted unilaterally to physically blockade Mr. Turner's property, and in doing so, delayed the construction of the elementary school we all voted for?" A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face tightened. "I acted on the advice of counsel to enforce a community easement." "Is it true," Tom interrupted, his voice rising, "that a judge ordered you to remove that blockade and you refused, forcing the sheriff's department to come to your home and enforce the order?" The murmur became a wave of shocked gasps. This was clearly news to many of them. Karen's eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally, but found only accusing stares. "That is a mischaracterization of a complex legal situation. And is it true," Tom pressed on, his voice like a hammer, "that because of your actions, this HOA is now being sued, not just by Mr. Turner for damages, but is also facing potential legal action from the school district? That you have exposed every single one of us to massive financial liability?" That was the kill shot. The issue was no longer about aesthetics or noise. It was about their money, their homes, their liability. The room erupted. People were shouting questions, demanding answers. Karen banged her gavel, but the noise only grew louder. "Order! Order!" she yelled, her voice cracking with desperation. In the midst of the chaos, a man stood up in the back. He was a local journalist I recognized from the county newspaper, a guy named Frank. Someone, Susan, or Tom, or maybe even Mr. Evans, had clearly tipped him off. "Mrs. Miller," he called out over the din, "Frank Gable, with the County Chronicle. Is it true that the new school project is over budget and behind schedule specifically because of your actions against the project's timber supplier?" Karen saw the reporter, and a look of pure panic crossed her face. Public exposure was her kryptonite. This was no longer an internal community dispute. This was about to be a front-page story. She ignored him, desperately trying to regain control of the meeting, but it was too late. The narrative was out of her hands. Ben chose this moment to act. He stood up, and his calm, authoritative presence cut through some of the noise. He walked to the front of the room. "If the residents of Whispering Pines would like to understand the full legal and financial jeopardy Mrs. Miller has placed you in," he said, his voice carrying easily, "I would be happy to explain it." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Ben. Karen looked at him, her expression one of pure hatred. "You have no right to speak here," she shrieked. "This is a private meeting." "Your lawyer is here, ma'am," Ben said calmly, gesturing to Mr. Cheatham, who was trying to look invisible in the corner. "I'm sure he'll agree that as a party to an ongoing lawsuit with the HOA, my client has a vested interest. And since you've been misrepresenting the facts of that lawsuit to your members, a little clarification is in order. He opened his briefcase. The trap was about to be sprung. He wasn't just there to speak. He was there to present the evidence. He was about to show them exactly who they had chosen as their leader. Ben Carter commanded the room with the quiet authority of a man who held all the cards. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply laid out the facts like a surgeon laying out his instruments. Mrs. Miller and her counsel, Mr. Cheatham, he began, have initiated and pursued a course of action against my client, Mr. Turner, based on a series of deliberate misinterpretations of the law. They did this, I will argue in court, not to protect this community, but to satisfy a personal vendetta on the part of Mrs. Miller. He held up a copy of my property's zoning certificate. Fact: Mr. Turner's land is zoned agricultural residential. His timber operation is a permitted, legal use of his land. He then held up the permits. Fact: he holds all necessary state and county permits for this work. Code enforcement has already found him to be in full compliance. The residents were listening with rapt attention. This was the first time they were hearing my side of the story without Karen's filter. Mrs. Miller, through the HOA, has attempted to fine my client thousands of dollars based on covenants that do not apply to him. When that failed, she filed a frivolous legal action based on a scenic easement that her own lawyer, he paused and looked pointedly at a sweating Mr. Cheatham, should have known was a utility easement that the HOA has no standing to enforce. Then he moved to the topic that truly mattered to them. Her actions have now directly threatened a multi-million-dollar public works project that this entire community depends on. I have here a formal letter from the school district's superintendent, Ben said, holding it up, stating that the delays caused by Mrs. Miller's illegal blockade will result in cost overruns, costs that the district may seek to recoup from the party responsible, this homeowners association. A collective groan went through the room. The abstract idea of a lawsuit had just been given a concrete, terrifying price tag, but Ben was just getting warmed up. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the reason he had subpoenaed the HOA's financial records as part of our counterclaim. Which brings me to the matter of how this legal crusade has been funded, he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the crowd in. Pursuant to our lawsuit, we subpoenaed the HOA's financial records for the last 6 months. He turned and looked directly at Karen, whose face had become a ghostly white mask. The records show that Mrs. Miller, without a full board vote, has paid the firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe over $20,000 in legal fees from the HOA's general fund to pursue this personal matter. She has also paid nearly $5,000 for a noise study that was designed to produce a specific result, and $2,000 for the surveyors who performed the illegal blockade. He let that sink in. $27,000 of their money from their monthly dues meant for landscaping, pool maintenance, and community events, had been spent on Karen's private war. The silence in the room was chilling. It was the silence of betrayal. Tom Albright stood up again, his face a thundercloud. Karen, is that true? Did you spend $27,000 without board approval? Karen stammered. It was a necessary expenditure to protect To protect what, Karen? A woman shouted from the back. My property value? You've probably cost me more than that in the lawsuit we're about to get hit with. The dam broke. The rage that had been simmering was now a full-blown flood. Recall, someone yelled. We need a recall vote. I make a motion for a vote of no confidence in the president. Tom Albright's voice boomed over the chaos. Seconded, another board member shouted immediately. Karen stood there stunned as her entire kingdom dissolved around her in a matter of minutes. She looked desperately at her lawyer, but Mr. Cheatham was already packing his briefcase, eager to distance himself from the sinking ship. The journalist Frank was scribbling furiously in his notepad, a gleam in his eye. He had his headline. Ben had one last piece of evidence. He pulled a small digital audio player from his pocket. And if there is any doubt about Mrs. Miller's motives or her conduct, he said, I'd like to play for you a recording of my client's first interaction with her. He pressed play. Karen's voice, shrill and filled with venomous confidence, filled the silent room. That hideous machine is a blight on this community, and I will have it removed and your property seized if necessary, Mr. Turner. You are in violation of covenants you clearly can't comprehend. I am the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I am this community's authority. You will learn your place." Hearing her own words, stripped of context and power, played back to the very people she claimed to represent, was the final, brutal humiliation. The recording laid bare her arrogance, her obsession with power, her utter contempt for anyone who defied her. There was no applause, just a heavy, disgusted silence. The motion for a vote of no confidence was called. It wasn't even close. By a show of hands, it was nearly unanimous. Karen was stripped of her presidency on the spot. She stood there for a moment, motionless, her face a crumpled mess of shock and defeat. Then, without a word, she turned and fled the room, pushing through the crowd of her former subjects, who parted before her not with respect, but with disdain. The meeting continued, with Tom Albright now at the helm. The first order of business was a unanimous vote to direct their lawyer to immediately withdraw the lawsuit against me. The second was to issue a formal, public apology to me and my family. The third was to launch a full audit of the HOA's finances and to explore legal action against Karen to recoup the misused funds. As Sarah and I walked out of the clubhouse an hour later, people came up to us, shaking my hand, apologizing for their behavior, for believing the lies. They were the same people who had glared at me just weeks before. Now they saw me not as an enemy, but as the man who had inadvertently liberated them from a tyrant. The war was over, and we had won. Not with threats or intimidation, but with patience, discipline, and the undeniable power of the truth. Standing in the parking lot, under the cool night sky, I felt a profound sense of peace. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered overwhelmingly and publicly. The days following the HOA meeting were like waking from a long, stressful dream. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over our property for months simply evaporated. The next morning, Tom Albright, the new acting HOA president, came to my gate. He wasn't flanked by lawyers or surveyors. He was alone, and he carried a peace offering, a box of donuts and 2 coffees. "Mr. Turner," he said, extending a hand, "on behalf of the entire Whispering Pines community, I want to formally and sincerely apologize. What Karen did was inexcusable. There's no other word for it." I shook his hand. "I appreciate that, Tom. Let's just put it behind us." "We're trying," he said with a weary sigh. "We've got the auditors going through the books. It looks worse than we thought. She was running this place like her own personal fiefdom. We're definitely pursuing legal action to get our money back." He looked over at the sawmill, which was humming away as I'd already started my day's work. "Frankly, we're all just glad the school is back on track. A lot of parents want to thank you." It was a complete reversal. The source of their animosity had become a point of communal pride. The local newspaper ran the story, a full-length feature with the headline, "HOA President Ousted After Harassing Veteran, Delaying School Project." Frank's article was a masterpiece of factual reporting, laying out the entire saga: my contract, Karen's harassment, the illegal blockade, the court order, and the explosive town hall meeting. It painted Karen as a cautionary tale of power, run amok in me as a quiet, determined landowner who simply refused to be bullied. The story made me something of a local celebrity, a role I was deeply uncomfortable with, but which had its perks. The petty harassment stopped instantly. Instead of glares, I got waves and thumbs ups. One Saturday, a group of dads from the HOA showed up with a cooler of drinks and offered to help me stack lumber for a few hours, a gesture of goodwill that meant more than any formal apology. The lawsuit Ben had filed was swiftly settled. The new HOA board, eager to stanch the bleeding, agreed to pay for all of my legal fees. More significantly, their insurance carrier, after reviewing the case and Karen's litany of misconduct, paid a substantial settlement for the damages related to the tortious interference. It was enough to pay off the sawmill, cover our living expenses for a year, and put a hefty down payment on the construction of our permanent home. Karen, meanwhile, was reaping what she had sown. The HOA was suing her to recover the $27,000 she had misappropriated. The court found her in contempt for defying the TRO, levying a fine that was, I'm told, painfully large. Her social standing in the community she had once ruled was annihilated. Her friends abandoned her. She became a pariah, a ghost in her own neighborhood. Within 2 months, a for sale sign appeared on her perfectly manicured lawn. I finished milling the timber for the school a few weeks ahead of the revised schedule. The final delivery was a moment of quiet triumph. As I watched the crane lift the last of the massive support beams, beams that had been trees on my land just months before, I felt an immense sense of completion. I had fulfilled my contract. I had defended my home. I had built something lasting. The groundbreaking ceremony for the new Whispering Pines Elementary School was held on a bright, sunny spring day, 6 months later. The entire community was there. The school board, the county commissioners, the families, the kids. Mr. Evans, the superintendent, made a point of singling me out in his speech. "This school is a testament to community," he said, "and it is built, quite literally, from this community. The beautiful wood you see framing this entrance was grown, felled, and milled right next door by Mr. Mark Turner. When this project faced an unexpected and unfortunate delay, Mr. Turner stood his ground with integrity and perseverance, ensuring that our children would have the school they deserve." The applause was warm and genuine. After the speeches, Sarah and I walked around the construction site. The framework was up, and the scent of the pine I had cut still hung in the air. I ran my hand along one of the huge exposed beams in what would be the library. It was solid, strong, and true. It felt real. In the distance across the field, I saw a moving truck parked in front of Karen's old house. New people, a young family with a toddler, were moving in. The last vestige of the conflict was being carried away in cardboard boxes. I looked at Sarah, and she was smiling, her eyes shining. "We did it," she said softly. "We built our quiet life." She was right. It hadn't been the peaceful start we envisioned. We had been tested, threatened, and dragged into a fight we never wanted. But in the end, by standing firm, by trusting in discipline and documentation, and by having faith in the fact that truth eventually wins out over lies, we had not only protected our dream, but we had helped restore a community. The quiet we had now was earned. And as I stood there, looking at the school built from my own trees, and the home we were about to build on our own land, I knew with absolute certainty that it was a peace no bully could ever take away from us again.